Okay, good. All right. Xin Nian Kuai Le. Happy New Year, everybody. First meeting in the year of the ox, right? Most of you were aware of that. As always, it will be an auspicious year. Every animal's auspicious, but this is notably your ox years are supposed to be strong patience, which I think the world needs right now. So welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I fancy there are a few new folks out there, so I always like telling the new folks about where you are. Woodrow Wilson Center was created in 1968 by Congress as a memorial to our former president, 40th President Woodrow Wilson, and not 40th President, 28th President. No, wait, that's in 4 years. In the future, this is a memorial. No. Anyway, I've been doing this for 10 years, so I'm allowed to mess up the intro at least once, right? Yes, and there are about 20 projects and programs here that focus on foreign policy issues, and in the spirit of Woodrow Wilson, trying to bring both the scholarly and the policy communities together. Now, the China Environment Forum has been, I think we're almost officially maybe a teenager now because we're 12 years old. I've been here for 10 years, and we are a meeting machine on everything focused on energy and environmental issues in China. And some of you may also know that last year we had a grant to look at food safety. I think all the cookies are safe, you guys, so just so you know. And looking at food safety issues in China with a focus also on how U.S.-China cooperation in those areas. Now, the China Environment Forum has long focused on energy and climate issues, over its 12-year history. And increasingly, we are doing more climate meetings. We are not experts in the whole global climate dialogue, debate, and whatnot. We really do focus more on China and sometimes climate change impacts from China in the region. And today's meeting is unique in the meetings we've done, and it's also a very important and very underreported issue. Climate change, the impacts of climate change on the Himalayas, and looking at both the ecological, human health, and security implications. And remember I said, you're the ox, good luck and all that. I've been really lucky because I could get three really smart people who know things about climate change on the Himalayas, and two of whom just happen to be on the East Coast this week. So I'm big into the whole kind of UN fun concept of fate and destiny, that this meeting was meant to happen. But let me tell you what we have here. We're going to start off with Isabel Hilton, who's going to be giving us a broader overview of the climate impacts in the Himalayas, and just beginning the discussion on why is this important? We've got more people coming. The RSVP was almost 100 folks. So I think some of you, if you don't know why, you have a feeling that this is an important topic. Isabel Hilton, she's the founder and the CEO of China Dialogue. It's a London-based bilingual media resource on environmental affairs in China and global climate change. It's the only bilingual website that does this kind of thing. I'm horribly envious. I look at her all the time. Bilingual. She has a fabulously diverse career in journalism in the UK, some in the US. You can look at the bios. You have all those details. The second speaker, again, another piece of luck. Besides getting Kenneth Hewitt down here from Canada, just the recommendation. I emailed a woman from Montana who spoke at the center a couple months ago, a Pakistan water expert, and she basically wrote back and said, "You must invite Kenneth Hewitt." I'm like, okay. I invite Kenneth Hewitt. I listen, I obey people that are very forceful. And he's going to be bringing, Isabel will focus predominantly also on the Tibetan Plateau. She'll talk a little broadly on Tibetan Plateau. And Kenneth brings in kind of a comparative element to the discussion, so it's not China. He focuses more on, and I always say I should make sure I know how to say this right. In Pakistan, Karakoram? Karakoram. It's like, messed up twice this morning. See, I usually do morning meetings. I'm not a good afternoon introducer here. And the Northwest Himalayas. He is the co-founder of the Cold Regions Research Center in Canada and a professor emeritus at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. And he's been working in this area for about 45 years and brings such an expertise. And he's a scientist. And I think it's always really important, kind of in the Wilson Center, we like diverse kind of speakers on our panels. And so we've got a journalist, have a scientist. And then we've got, academic, but she's not a boring academic. This is Catherine Morton, who's a fellow in the Department of International Relations at Australian National University, but she's a Brit. Notably, all of them are British today. I've never had this happen before, so rather cool. She's a China specialist, and her research interests include global civil society, international environmental politics. And she's also been doing work in Tibetan communities, looking at climate change impacts in the region, but looking more also at the communities themselves, who are as vulnerable, if not more so, than the environment in this region. Before I stop, I do also like to acknowledge before in the meetings, and but I do it at the beginning. I want to acknowledge my funders, the USAID, Rockefeller Brother Funds, and Waters Corporation. And this meeting was made possible by Wilson Center Federal Conference Fund. So we kind of say, yay, funders who support what I think is important work that we do. And now here's the game plan. These three people are going to talk intelligently. You will listen, applaud at the proper times, get cookies if you need strength, and we're going to start. You okay? Nod. Okay, good. So Isabel, it's your show now.
Thank you.
I'm silly, I know.
Not at all, Jennifer. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting us to do this. China Dialogue, as Jennifer said, is a bilingual not-for-profit as it happens, though any hints on how we could change that would be welcome. A resource on climate and environment, and it is about creating constructive dialogue on these issues, which tend to lapse into finger-pointing if one isn't very careful. So we publish into China material that we think that our Chinese readers, and more than half our readers are Chinese, would like to know and wouldn't necessarily have access to. And we publish from China Chinese writers, analysts, reporters, policymakers, and so on, whom non-Chinese readers would not necessarily have access to. So it's an exercise in trying to be useful to both sides, and it's an exercise in trying to create a space in which neither is privileged over the other. So it's the same experience, whichever language you bring to it, and we feel that this approach is important to building the kind of dialogue and the kind of exchange that we are going to need, particularly on climate issues going forward. One of the reasons that today's issue has become important, I think, for me, is that of all the climate issues that we look at in China Dialogue, this is both one of the biggest, most important, most scary, if you're inclined to be scared, and the one in which there is, shall we say, a cooperation deficit right now, and one in which cooperation is going to be essential if the issue is not to turn bad, and that cooperation fostered in the right way could actually do a lot of good to a lot of issues, including the one directly related to glacier melt in the Himalayas. It's, as Jennifer said, a relatively unreported issue, or an issue that, considering this affects 40% of the world's population, potentially, this sounds big to me. So why is this story not, in the forefront of our minds? And as a journalist, one asks oneself questions about what stories get told and why these stories get told, what stories don't get told. And one of the reasons I think that this story perhaps hasn't been told as it might is that Tibet occupies a particular place in the Western imagination. And we have ideas about what Tibet is, which are to do with tropes of our own, either David and Goliath tropes or oppression resistance tropes, or all kinds of things which, many of which, of course, are true, but they're not the only narrative. They're the narrative we prefer. And in these narratives, Tibet is a very remote place. It's exoticized. It's full of rather exotic people. Now, the only thing I didn't actually discover was how I move this on.
I think just hit the down.
Down. Oh, right. Nope. Mouse click. Sorry, this is... I'm a Mac user, and there we go. And our narratives have tended to focus on the people and the various conflicts and so on. And this, as I say, does make Tibet into a remote and distant place. And it's part of my job today to, I think, encourage us all to think of Tibet not as somewhere kind of out there on the edge of the known world, but as somewhere that is actually in the centre of a region, and is absolutely critical to that region. And I think that we need to pull back from the focus on these people. We need to pull back first to the landscape, and then really, as far as we can, pull back so that we begin to see this place as really we need to pull back far enough so that the political boundaries that actually function in a way to obscure the geographical connections and the physical connections melt away. So I guess that's my job. Any definition around Tibet, of course, is highly charged, but this is what we're talking about, the Tibetan the Qinghai Tibet Plateau, which is an area of about 2.5 million square kilometres, equivalent to around a third of the continental United States. And it's the largest and highest elevation region on Earth, with an average elevation of 4,500 metres above sea level. And it stretches for about 3,000 kilometres from west to east and 1,500 kilometres from south to north. It is huge, and it's ringed by mountains that include the Himalaya, the Karakoram, the Kunlun, across the north. And then if you ignore the political boundaries, the higher elevation regions of the Himalayan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, as well as all of the Tibet Autonomous Region, Qinghai Province, Western Sichuan Province, Northern Yunnan, Western Gansu, Southern Xinjiang, inside the People's Republic. We've rather, and in these mountains, in this great horseshoe of mountains, as you can see from this satellite picture, are the glaciers that actually are what keeps this region alive. And we've rather taken the role of glaciers in the world's water supply for granted, and I think most people still do, despite the warnings. And I noticed that Steve Chu issued a rather stark warning about the future of California the other day. And actually, we're all, a great deal of the world's population is connected to this rather benign effect of glaciers of storing water and releasing it when we need it. It's not that the world is short of water, it's just that most of it is not up to our purposes because it's salt. And of what remains, nearly 70% is stored as snow and ice, either in the poles or in glaciers. It's humanity's water tank, and they collect fresh water in the winter and they very obligingly release it in the spring and summer. And millions of people depend on this system for agriculture, for drinking water, for living. So the Himalayan glaciers contain the largest store of fresh water outside the polar regions. And because of this strategic location, think back to that regional picture, they do supply 40% of the world's population to some degree or other with water. And if you look at this map, you see the rivers that originate in these mountains. They originate from the plateau. They're not all 100% dependent on glaciers, but to some degree or other they all are. This is the largest river runoff from any single location in the world, and it's the plateau is the headwaters environment where the Yellow River, the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Salween, the Brahmaputra, the Ganges, the Sutlej, the Indus rivers. This is an inventory of the great rivers of Asia. They all rise there. So the management of these river source environments has regional and indeed global implications, and the water from these watersheds is critical to the survival of literally millions of people downstream. And indeed, when there are floods in the Indian states of Bihar and Assam, we should look at the critical role of the Tibetan environment in regulating water flow, because the Kosi River that floods, in Bihar has its origins on the north side of Mount Everest. So what's happening to these glaciers? Well, with some exceptions that we will hear about from Kenneth, the glaciers are substantially in retreat. They are. This is a very large and complicated region, and so there's a lot we don't know about it. But the scientific consensus from the UN, from people like Yao Tandong, who's China's foremost glacier scientist, is that the majority, within Karakoram as an exception, the majority of the glaciers across this region are in retreat. Some 15,000 glaciers, which cover 33,300 square kilometres in Bhutan, Nepal and Pakistan. Selected river basins in China were covered in a baseline research program. And as I say, the information, the continued research on these glaciers suggests that they will be gone by 2050. Now, this is a complicated picture, and you get differential effects. There are two major weather systems in this region. One is dependent on the monsoon, the other depends on the westerlies. And you get different behaviours. But in general, to speak very loosely, there is a very large proportion of these glaciers are at mid-levels, which is melting faster. The whole plateau is a climate change hotspot, but the mid-level glaciers are retreating faster than the high-altitude ones. It's just bad luck that they form quite a substantial proportion of what's there. I want to talk a little bit about how we know what we know and what we don't know about glaciers in this region. I do so with some trepidation in the presence of a real expert, but I'm giving you a sort of overview here. It's vast, and one of the reasons we don't know an awful lot, or we don't know as much as we need to know, is that glaciers happen at rather high altitudes, and in order to be most of the early ice science was done at the poles, which are convenient in the sense that they're at low altitude. To be a glacier scientist, you need to be a bit crazy. You need to be able to work in the death zone for months on end. You need to be able to lug incredibly heavy equipment up 18,000 20,000 feet up a mountain, drill an ice core, get it back down the mountain, and all of this in places which often don't have roads or don't have any of the facilities that might assist you. So you really do have to be a bit mad. And one of the maddest and most important glacier scientists was an American called Lonnie Thompson, who did the first ice core drilling in China, and he pioneered ice core drilling in the tropical zones, because in the early days of this science it was thought that the polar regions really told you all you need to know. You get an ice core from the Greenland ice cap, and it tells you all you need to know about the climate record. And Lonnie Thompson was one of those young scientists who argued that the tropical zones actually have a bigger impact on the world's weather, because you can have a weather event in polar regions, and it doesn't really affect the middle of the planet. You have a weather event in the tropical zones, and it touches both hemispheres. So he argued that scientists should start looking at the climate record in tropical ice, which meant hiking everything up 20,000 feet. However, he told me the other week that science advances one funeral at a time, and as a young scientist he was very much confronting the weight of received opinion which was against him. However, he's now received opinion himself, and tries to keep an open mind on what should be done. But it is very difficult. And you're looking at countries where there isn't a mountaineering tradition, India, Pakistan. You're looking at countries where science and glacier science is pretty much a new thing. You're looking, in some cases, at very poor countries where there simply isn't the manpower or the money to spend on this, and you're looking at a vast region, a vast collection of glaciers. So that just in terms of the science, there's an awful lot that we don't know. We now have satellite mapping, but unless you're collecting data on the ground as well, you can go very far wrong with remote sensing. So it's patchy. The other thing about the Himalayan glaciers, as opposed to the alpine glaciers, where there's been a kind of mountaineering and photography tradition for a long time, is that that combination of visual record of people who were going up mountains and taking pictures, which gives you a kind of historical measure of retreat, is relatively sparse in this region. Again, for reasons of sociology, of culture, not a lot of people were doing that. Quite a lot of Brits, actually, who were knocking about the region in the late 19th and early 20th century, who do supply some of the historic record, and against which it is possible to measure things like this. If you look at the shrinkage here, the top picture is obviously the earlier one, and that was actually taken in 1981, that top picture, and then photographed again in 2007 by Greenpeace. Again, look at what's happened here. This is in Himachal Pradesh, and you have in 1988 you can see the glacier there. By 2003, it's almost gone. Oops. Sorry. Brown cloud. Okay, and here, this is from the Everest region. I mean, this is just to give you a sense. And what I was saying about the lower and mid-level glaciers is very clear on this picture. So in the 1950s, you see at the bottom, if you just follow that mountain round there, you see a fair collection of mid-level glaciers. And if you look at the lower picture, they've all disappeared. And all this is happening because the region's a climate change hotspot. And it's happening now. So whatever we do about climate change, and I'm not hugely optimistic about the global deal as things stand, the most we can hope for is that we limit the average rise in temperatures to 2 degrees centigrade. And we're going to be quite lucky if we manage to do that. The point is the glaciers are melting now. And whatever we do, we're not going to lower the temperature in the lifetime of anyone in this room. We're not going to lower the global average temperature. So there is no rolling back of the clock, it seems to me, on these glaciers. So we need to start planning for what happens. There is another factor, which I won't go into with any, because I'm sure I'm going to talk over my time, but it's the Asian brown cloud, which is also complicating things on the plateau, which is obviously a product of industrialization in Asia. So if the glaciers could be gone by 2050, there really isn't very much that we can do about it in terms of stopping them melting. So we have to start thinking about, well, all right, what does this region look like? And what do we need to start thinking about now in order that this crisis doesn't become a real disaster? There have been various, approaches to this problem over the years, and I think that we have to sort of guard against hubris and geoengineering solutions. There's a story about Tianshan, which is as it happens, this is the glacier with the longest record of study in China. And the reason why there is the longest record here is because in the 50s, during the Great Leap Forward, when Mao Zedong was convinced that man could conquer nature in all sorts of ways, they studied Tianshan because they were desperate to melt it. They were desperate to melt it in order to produce water to irrigate the Hershey corridor, in order to follow the theories of Lysenko and triple agricultural yields. So they spread coal dust on it. They bombed a nearby glacier. I mean, there are hysterical contemporary accounts of the enthusiastic masses going up to kind of destroy these glaciers. So I think we ought to be a little bit humble in the face of nature and realize that we've been very wrong in the past about what's desirable. It's a story that's almost forgotten now, and it went along with the notion of colonizing the western regions of China, which in fact are probably not apt for very much larger populations than there are. So anyway, the situation we're faced with now, which I think we should approach with a certain amount of humility, is this accelerated melt. Now, the accelerated melt is obviously a long-term threat to the water supply. It's also a short-term threat to downstream populations. What happens when a glacier starts to melt is that you get at the terminus, you get terminus lakes. The water runs off, natural barriers hold the water back, so you get spontaneous natural lakes formed, many of which are very unstable, and as the water builds up, they can give way. They have given way. They've given way with pretty catastrophic consequences for downstream peoples, particularly in Nepal, which is one of the countries most affected by this, so that you get a build-up of water behind, as I say, moraine. It gives way, and this kind of avalanche of rubble and water pours downstream with pretty devastating effects on those who live downstream. And the more the glaciers melt, the more lakes are being built up. Another map we don't really have. We don't really know how many of them there are, and we don't really know in what sort of dangerous condition they are. But there are some examples which are sufficiently worrying to tell us that this is an immediate, this is this is an imminent threat, as well as the long-term threat to water supplies. Then there are the downstream effects, which I've touched on when we began, and the question of what happens to the river flow downstream to all the people who depend on it. And the question of the region and how the region will respond to this. I mean, if we look at this region, it is, it's not what you call a nice neighborhood. If you look around, starting up on the top left of that map, with Afghanistan, Northwest Frontier Province, Pakistan, Kashmir, Pakistan, India, India, China. All of these are entities which have had their own troubles and troubles with their neighbours. Many of these boundaries continue extremely sensitive, and these sensitivities are an impediment to cross-border scientific collaboration, and they're certainly an impediment to a collaborative approach to this issue. Add to that the fact that only the Indus in this map has a transboundary river agreement. And think about what happens when, this is a picture, I'm sure you remember this, a war, this is the glacier on which a war was fought between India and Pakistan, the Siachen Glacier. And this war nearly led to a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan, which was only prevented when Nawaz Sharif flew to talk to Bill Clinton. Something Musharraf never forgave. This is another story, but anyway, Musharraf then deposed him because he spoiled his fun. Anyway, this is an illustration of the sensitivities of this region. There are sensitivities also between India and China, where India refuses to share data with Chinese scientists because it's considered a security issue, because the Ganges, is one of the rivers potentially affected. So where you need to have collaboration, you have a neighbourhood that has a very recent history of conflict, and almost none of the mechanisms that you would wish to have if you were trying to build cooperation. The Gangotri is the glacier from which the Ganges derives. And then as you go further down, downstream, you get to Bangladesh. Already extremely vulnerable to climate change. It's very low-lying. It regularly floods. It's subject to tidal surges, and this can only get worse. Now, that fence that you see there is a fence which has been built by India along the border with Bangladesh, supposedly for containing terrorism, cross-border terrorism, which, not that I've noticed, has been a huge issue in India. But what is a huge issue, and certainly a much bigger potential issue, is what's going to happen. Bangladesh is the country that could produce more climate refugees than anywhere else in the near future. And what that fence says to me is that wherever those people are going to go, they're not going to go to India. So, at the moment we have an extremely spiky diplomatic atmosphere. This is one security analyst's graphic of how this situation could lead to conflict. And indeed it could. But it really doesn't have to. And I think that part of what we're trying to build on China Dialogue and on the Third Pole Project is a regional consciousness that makes the case that collaboration now could prevent a conflict which actually would benefit nobody, but into which it could be quite easy to drift. So my shopping list is we need more scientific cooperation. At present bedeviled in several countries by intelligence and security considerations, as though keeping secrets was somehow going to help to keep the glaciers. We need transboundary river agreements. Diminishing supply is a potential source of conflict. How will dam building, for instance, China has the tap, how will dam building on these rivers affect the people downstream? Should those dams be being built at all? Is climate change factored in to the planning of those dams? Is the seismological impact of those dams, this is all an earthquake zone, is that being factored in? We need, to continue my shopping list, we need the creation of regional fora, of collaborative regional fora. At present, there are no bodies that correspond to the shape of the problem. And that's a problem in climate change in general. It's particularly a problem here. And we need mechanisms which take the science and which turn it into policy. And we need, finally, active research and planning for adaptation, because this is going to happen. And we need to begin to plan now for that 40% of the world's population that's going to be affected. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And actually, we're going to do a switch because Isabel, she's like me. She's a Mac lady. So we're going to leave Macland and switch out here. So I think I can probably have time for maybe one question directly to Isabel while we're doing this swap. Does anyone have a question? And my intern's with the microphone handy dandy. Was there one quick question? Still shocked. They're stunned.
Yeah.
They're like, okay, here's a question here.
Graham Smith, working with the World Bank on Bangladesh at the moment, and just aware that the new government that took office in Bangladesh is talking with India.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether you have any information as to whether that your agenda might find its way onto their agenda.
Well, I would be delighted if it did. And it's actually Bangladesh is also interesting because they are they think very constructively about adaptation for obvious reasons. And Bangladesh has one of the more advanced programs on adaptation and on survival of whatever might happen. So I think that there's a great deal to learn from Bangladesh. I don't have any particular information on your question, but I would hope that just the fact that they're talking to them, this has to be an issue that they talk about, and I would hope that we could get a more constructive engagement on those.
And let me add, before then I let Kenneth start here, is that I do have a stack that the nice folks at International Rivers sent me hard copy. They have a new report called Mountains of Concrete, Dam Building in the Himalayas. And we're hoping at a later forum, pending fundraising, of course, is the author to bring him over from India to talk more about this. It doesn't focus on China, it focuses on Nepal and Pakistan. But the impact, because there's a lot of dams being built, because, hey, it's melting. We can do something with this, right? All right.
Hydroelectric power.
Hydroelectric power. Kenneth, can I... So you're okay? Do you want to stand up there?
I think I'm going to go from here.
Going to go from here. All right.
To see this.
And what do I push to move it along?
You just, you're just going to,
Just do that.
up and down.
Okay.
Even I can do that. I'm good at that.
Hello. I think I want to follow Isabel by saying I'm going to be talking about how complicated it is, because I may sound like a climate denier, climate change denier. However, I'm really going to be talking about the complexity of understanding what is happening to the glaciers. The picture which I'm starting with may just seem to be advertising or something, but it's chosen seriously. This is in the center of the largest mass of glaciers in the Himalaya. It also happens to be the one which Isabel has already mentioned, having the greatest direct influence on the lives of about 200 million people. Some share of the water going from these glaciers affects much of the population of Pakistan, some parts of Afghanistan, and Xinjiang province in China. It's not chosen just because it's pretty. It's chosen because, in a way, it's representative. If you're looking in the direction of the photograph, I could take comparable photographs for about 250 kilometers in that direction, which is eastward. I could take comparable photographs for 200 kilometers behind where the photograph's taken, and for over 100 kilometers on either side. Now, I think you'll agree this is the kind of landscape you do not associate with Pakistan or even the Tibetan Plateau. There are probably 2,000 to 3,000 cubic kilometers of ice here. Now, Isabel has introduced the crisis. I think this is the photo one needs to start with for the crisis in this particular region. And just imagine for a moment that it was the banking crisis. I don't know much about banks, but I think you all agree that what's going on in all the debate is how much money do they really have? How much real money or real wealth is in the banking system? As opposed to that which has been lost or that which is insecure and that which is toxic. What is the real wealth that we have to work with to sustain, that's going to be available? Well, if I was using the same imagery of the glaciers, that's where it is. And unlike the banks, who seem very often not to want to tell you exactly what they've got or what the scale of the problem is, I'm telling you that's exactly where it is. This is where the snow and ice is. Where my guys are standing there, the ice is 800 meters thick, almost 2,000 feet. It travels for about 45 kilometers behind me. And the banking parallel is not just, again, to pick up on something. When we talk about the health of glaciers, we talk about their budget. We talk about the mass balance budget of the glacier, which is the relationship between the snowfall, which nourishes the glacier, the input, the through flow of ice from, in this case, high altitude to lower altitudes where it will melt, which is kind of like its liquidity. And below us is the place that we're really most interested in, which is where the melting takes place of that ice at lower elevations to yield the water, which I guess is like the money that can be borrowed and lent and invested, because that's what we really want. So, as I say, my picture is not irrelevant to that. But the other thing I have to say about it is it makes you realize that in Asia, especially in Tibet, the Himalaya, the Tian Shan, the Pamir, the Hindu Kush, it's all about elevation. And almost everything we hear about climate change is kind of global, regional. The guys are standing at about 4,800 meters, 15,000 feet or something. That's actually the turnover between accumulation from snow and the melting region down below. All of the snow that nourishes the glacier is above that, up to, in this picture, about 6,500 meters, in total up to about 8,000 meters in the watershed. The health of this glacier is in this elevation band, that is 4,000 meters and higher above where we're sitting here. What does climate do up there? Well, as Isabel has already pointed out, one of the major problems is we know so little about it. We're based almost entirely on near sea level climate observations. Even in this region, the climate stations are almost all below 3,000 meters. They're below the glaciers. Okay.
I feel like he's doing like a yoga pose.
Yes. The other reason it's important is, I think we've already said, it's the upper reaches of the Indus Valley, with Pakistan as the major dependent on snow and ice melt from this region. But also we've got Afghanistan, we've got the upper Yarkand River, and major irrigation and other projects in Inner Asia dependent on it. But Another thing which is on the website version of this paper are quotations from about 8 different sources within the last 5 years, including, I'm afraid, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and World Wildlife and UNDP and The Guardian and The Economist and so on. And I could also have quoted the newspapers of Pakistan and India, all of which are saying these glaciers are disappearing, that within 50 years they'll be gone. Well, I have been absolutely unable to find any evidence that that's true on the ground in the field. And in fact, this particular map, which is only up to 2004, shows a whole bunch of glaciers which are advancing and thickening. The snow and ice cover of the upper Indus Basin, as of this moment, is not declining. In fact, it declined massively between the 1920s and the 1970s, following the Little Ice Age. But since then, there's been very little net change, and the glaciers from the highest parts of the range have been thickening, and in many cases, about 30 glaciers of intermediate size and dozens of high-altitude small tributary glaciers I have found are advancing. If you ask the farmers in the valleys of the Himalaya, in this region, in the Karakoram, what's been going on, they will tell you the growing season's getting longer since the 1950s, as long as they can remember. Winters are warmer, there's less snow, and there's more rain. And a look at the climate records from the stations at low elevation suggests that there has been winter warming and summer cooling. But of course that's at low elevation. What's happening high up, where the snow falls and the melting occurs, is a much more complicated thing. The Baltoro Glacier, some of you may know this. This takes you to K2 and Gasherbrum and Masherbrum and all those tremendous peaks. That's its terminus. And the boulder I'm showing there has been a marker for the position of the terminus since the 1890s, when Conway came this way. Since the 1950s, the glacier has advanced slowly in most years. It advanced quite rapidly in the late 1990s, was going back in the early 2000s, and when I was there taking this picture in 2005, it was coming forward a bit again. This is a very high altitude glacier. This is the highest altitude glacier you can think about. What's going on? There are other glaciers advancing. So this is an interesting one. I don't know whether you can make sense of it, but this is the glacier here leaning over its original lateral moraines here. This is the same, the ice leaning over the lateral moraines. When I first went to the Karakoram in the 1960s, what really annoyed me was any time you wanted to get onto the ice, you had to go down to it, down horrible, rubbly moraines. And there were all those wonderful pictures from the late 19th, early 20th century with the ice standing up as it is here above the lateral moraines. That was the Little Ice Age. That was a period of major advance. On this glacier, we're seeing major thickening, which will probably lead to a major advance. I'm going to skip that. So what I'm trying to get at is we need to focus our attention on those things that are special to glaciers, special to each region, special to these particular glaciers at high elevation. Before I go on, since I'm apparently dumping on the climate change argument, I am not. I am convinced there is warming at high elevation in the Karakoram. It's just happening at such an elevation that the temperatures are still below zero. If you warm in the snow and ice zone, you still get snow and ice. In the meantime, I think the major thing that's happening is that the summer monsoon is coming into the basin much stronger and more frequently, and we're getting summer cloudiness, which is reducing the rate of melting, which is what you might expect from global warming, which is warming the oceans more than anything else. What happens to a warming ocean? Among other things, it evaporates more. Where does the moisture go? Again, just to fix the mind on these things, in this particular region, and I think it's a very important region, this is Biafo Glacier. This is its, I have to go over here, sorry. It's about 3 kilometers wide here. It's about 65 kilometers long. That's the middle ablation zone. This is where the business happens. This is where you get your water. Between 3,800 and 4,800 meters above sea level, from about 13,000 feet to 15,000 feet. That's where you get your water from. That is supplying 1% of the Indus flow from just this ice mass. In summer, here, over 2 months only, you get about 5 meters of ice melted. 5 meters of water equivalent of ice, which would be 6 meters of ice. Down here, it's as much as 8 meters. Up there, it's about 2. The glacier is between 500 and 1,100 meters thick in this region. This is the terminus of the glacier, way, way down here. Notice it's totally covered in debris. As you increase the melting, the amount of debris covers the ice and protects it against melting. So in the lower reaches of the Biafo, the melting is actually a few centimeters. Even though it's much warmer, even though the melting season here lasts about 7 months, it lasts about 2.5 months here, it lasts a few weeks up there. Getting your head around the elevation factors is important. Meanwhile, 2/3 of that glacier looks like that. Okay. Getting the technology
here.
This is the accumulation zone. Remember the budget model? This is where it comes from. This is where the input of snow. And what our work in the 1980s found, Isabella's talked about this lack of scientific work. We did a 4-year project with the Water and Power Development Authority in Pakistan. And we went up in here and we did snow pits and drilling. And we found out the maximum precipitation in the upper Indus Basin is between 5,000 and 6,000 meters above sea level. And it's here. And it's between 1 and 2 meters of water equivalent a year. Most of the models until that time had assumed that the precipitation was the same as that in the weather stations down below, which is about 150 to 200 millimeters. So again, whatever climate change is going to do to change the glacial picture in Inner Asia, this is one of the places where, for the major glacier cover, and I should add, it's very different from what you're looking at in Nepal and the Indian Himalaya and on the Tibetan Plateau. For reasons again mentioned, we found in our snow chemistry studies in the pits and cores in this area that 2/3 of the snow was falling in winter, coming from the Atlantic, westerlies. 1/3 is coming in the summer, mostly with monsoon-derived precipitation. You get particular chemical signatures in the snow that tell you where it's coming from, which season it's falling at, and so on. So those are the kinds of things that you have to study to understand the character of change. And I'm sorry that most of our work on glacier change has looked at the termini, because the end of the glacier is so much easier to watch and observe. More people are going to be around. It's a clearer kind of division. It's very hard to get the exact changes at high elevation. But some of these glaciers, this one in particular, the terminus is still retreating. It's been retreating since 1973, slowly. But the middle reaches have thickened 10 to 15 meters. And that will eventually, because this thing is almost 70 kilometers long, get to the terminus and it will advance. So Jennifer told me this must not be complicated.
He's doing a pretty good job so far, right?
But I'm going to show you two diagrams which are terribly complicated, but again, it is because the problem is complicated. First of all, this is the climate vertically. We go from semi-arid, summer drought, up to humid, but all the humid is in the snow zone. And this is the area altitude of the glacier. So most of its area, as you see here, is at these elevations between 4,500 and 6,000 meters. And that's actually the accumulation, the snowfall. And just to complicate it even more, this is a glacier, roughly like the ones we've been looking at, going from 3,000 meters to about 7,500 meters. And it's complicated. On the one hand, we have the climate. This is the amount of precipitation, increasing with elevation up to probably 6,000 meters. This is the mean air temperature from about plus 10 down here to minus 25 up there. And then all of that speaks to the glacier through these things. Snowfall becomes avalanche. I reckon that 80% of the snow which forms the glaciers of the Karakoram is avalanched before it gets into the glacier. 80%. I don't think we have a clue what climate change is going to do to avalanching. And yet it's the most important driver of accumulation in these glaciers. And so we go on down. Lower glacier, we have warmer temperatures, warmer ice, but we have covers of debris which protect them from melting. So just to reinforce the same message, here you have the business end, the bottom line of the glacial. Okay. Up here, the perennial snowfields that feed the glacier. Starting here, this zone of exposed ice with thin dirt and dust on it, which melts very rapidly in the summer. And then starting down here, this heavily debris-covered ice, which doesn't respond very well to the climate at all, because it's protected against melting. And then, to reiterate some of the things that Isabel started to talk about, for Pakistan, we could say similar things for the Yarkand Basin in China. The bulk of the meltwater yields coincide with the summer monsoon. So when there's a ton of water around from the monsoon, rains usually, that's when the glaciers are melting. tricky. 90% of the glacier melt comes in about 2 months of the year. Variability of summer weather is critical. And just running down, really important. You know what I mean by shoulder season. When you think that's spring and fall. Spring is critical for planting of crops, for when all the reservoirs are way down, etc. So when does the melting kick in? Is it delayed a week, a month? Most of the complaints from Pakistan about drought and terrible conditions and load shedding where they can't get enough electricity in the cities and so on are in that shoulder season of spring when the reservoirs are way down and the melting is delayed. Then at the other end, in the fall, the critical problem is when do you start filling up your reservoirs, holding the water back while you still have a flood risk? So you're trying to balance. In the main part of the summer, massive amounts of water, usually. In the main part of the winter, none from the glaciers. So those shoulder seasons are pretty critical. And that's kind of part of this complexity thing we're talking about again. It's not just enough to say how much water there is or how fast the glaciers are going back or coming forward. We need to know how that fits in with the economies, the stresses that are really significantly impacted by the availability of meltwater. You can also see how there are going to be very different stories when you take care of the mountain people's concerns, the villages in the Karakoram. They're actually not interested at all in the big glaciers except for portering for mountaineering expeditions. They get their water from tiny ice masses and snowmelt because they can control it technically. The big glaciers are of interest to the Pakistan government and the global community. Then we have the question, should they be building large dams? A new large dam is in progress on the Indus near Nanga Parbat at the moment. And on the one hand, there are these serious questions we're raising here of what's happening to the glacier melt and its future. There also happen to be some others. Well, I think I'm just about done, aren't I?
Yes.
So do I? Have I got?
I'll give you a couple more minutes.
Couple more minutes, okay.
You're done. That's excellent. You're doing fine.
So, a number of different things. We don't know much about avalanche nourishment of glaciers. Those polar and European glaciers that we've done so much work on are predominantly directly snow-fed, not these huge avalanche-fed glaciers we're dealing with here, which not only alters the thermal characteristics of the ice, it alters the rate at which the change from snow to glacier ice, you know, that's a metamorphosis of the ice. Glacier ice is very different from other kinds of ice. That's why it, as we say, flows, becomes a plastic. Being avalanche changes the picture compared to... Then I've talked about all this debris. Because the ice is avalanched, it's very dirty ice. There's a lot of debris and rubbish in it. And in the lower glacier, melting liberates that and covers the surface. What this particular research has done, and there's a bunch of it, is show how the cover on the surface of the ice affects the rate of melting. So if you have a complete cover, you get almost zero melting. If you have clean ice, you get a fair amount of melting. But two things you notice, it doesn't change much between different weather conditions. And then if you have thin covers of wet dirt, you get higher levels of melting. And in full sun weather, you get double the amount of melting you would get on clean ice. we still don't really have a clue what the relative distribution of debris covers and non-debris covers is on these glaciers. Isabel raised the question of glacial lake outburst floods. Again, the picture in Nepal and Bhutan and the Tian Shan and some other is quite different from the picture in the upper Indus Basin. We haven't had a serious gloff in the upper Indus Basin since 1931. But the lakes which caused those gloughs weren't 2 or 5 kilometers long, they were 25 to 30 kilometers long. They were immense lakes. And they came primarily from advancing glaciers, where the glacier advances. This is the main river valley here, this is in Shimshal, and the glacier advances across and forms a barrier across a main river valley. Then you can get a huge lake. Now it just so happens that in Shaksgam, on the China side, Xinjiang side of the Karakoram, the advancing glaciers have in the last decade begun to dam the rivers again, particularly the Shaksgam, and to create a series of gloughs, glacial lake outburst floods, going down towards the Tarim Basin. Quite dangerous. That hasn't yet happened in the Karakoram, the upper Indus Basin, but I think, and this is the other point to emphasize, that it isn't only diminishing glaciers that are a problem. Expanding glaciers are a problem. They're expanding glaciers are a problem because they store the ice and reduce the amount of meltwater you get, and they create a whole series of different hazards, of which the ice dam problem in the upper Indus Basin is a major one. Another thing that has increased dramatically in the last 20 years is the incidence of glacier surges. Now, a glacier surge is when a glacier which has been moving at about half a meter or a meter a day suddenly accelerates to 10, 20 meters a day, even 50 meters a day, which may not sound like a train, but it really is quite a... This is one, this is in mid-surge. When that happens, they can advance 5, 6, 7 kilometers in a few months. And, of course, they create these walls of ice. These are shepherds from one of the villages we worked out of. They used to lead their... excuse me, I'm pointing at that one. These are shepherds. And we just used to walk onto the ice here, and the animals would go to the high pastures across the ice, no problem. Now, it's absolutely impossible. And so suddenly there's a barrier for about 10 kilometers, and they have to take their animals great distances around. Why? We have reasonable records of the glacier surges on the major glaciers since the 1840s. We've had double the number in the last 30 years of all of that 150-year record. It's almost certainly about climate change, but we're not quite sure how that works because surges do not follow climate change. They are peculiar to each glacier. Those of you who are familiar with the Alaska glaciers will know that's one of the other places where you have lots of surges. Karakoram is one of them. As far as I know, you don't get them in Nepal or Bhutan or on the Tibetan Plateau or in the Tian Shan, but you get them in the Karakoram. That's something to do with that altitude thing and the temperature of the ice and steepness and relief. Just one last one. I better stop.
Yeah, I mean, this is great. Couldn't you listen to him all day?
One of the things you'll find in the I'm pretty sure it's the World Bank report on glacier change in Asia, is that the melting of the glaciers and their retreat will trigger major rock avalanches. And there's not much doubt that rock avalanches like the one you see here have come from glacially oversteepened and then, as we say, debuttressed. So the ice is there, it goes away, the rock walls are exposed. And that is a major problem. Again, we're having difficulty deciding what the problem is going to be if the glaciers are advancing with respect to this problem. But we have had 10 rock avalanches like this onto glaciers in the last 25 years. That's one of them. So, a lot of complicating issues. Thank you.
Okay, this is great. Applaud this man. No, that actually, as I kind of hinted at the beginning, we're hoping in the China Environment Forum, together also with, like today, Asia Program and Environmental Change Security Program, to do more meetings like this. Because, and you all, I think, would agree, we're not afraid of the complexity, and that we're trying, want to get the scientists and the policy and the academic researchers together to kind of talk about and kind of figure out this issue. And I actually understand glaciers now better, don't you guys? That really helped me a lot. Okay. My chatter-filled time for you. Nearly done. Do you want to have the hand mic? No? Okay.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk in that mic?
I think that's all right, yeah.
Okay, and if it's a problem, I'll switch out.
Okay. Good afternoon. 新年快乐. 다시 들래. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank Jennifer Turner for inviting me and giving the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to provide a social science perspective, which hopefully you'll find complementary to the two previous presentations. My work essentially brings together security analysis in the field of international relations with field-based research that I've been conducting at the center of the Tibetan Plateau in Qinghai, Yushu Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture, over the past 6 years. Yushu is, as I said, right at the center of the plateau. It's sparsely populated, about 270,000 in terms of its total population. Largely ethnic Tibetan, about 98% are ethnically Tibetan. Very, very poor region where average incomes are something like $50 per year. So major challenges here, not only of livelihood, sustainability, but now on top of that, this issue of climate change. And I have to admit that when I started my fieldwork back in 2003, climate change was not a major part of it. It's something that I started to discover on the way. And clearly, as our understanding of the impacts have evolved over time, it's become much more of a major part of my research agenda. And I have a particular interest in the security implications. So I'm going to sort of return to that issue of security that Isabel raised at the beginning. And maybe focus a little bit more on why taking a security approach can be valuable. How exactly is it beneficial? To also ask the question of what are the local impacts on communities on the plateau, drawing on my field research, and then broaden out to look at the issue of regional cooperation. And I will provide a few suggestions which I hope we can sort of return to during our discussions after the presentation. It's clear to me that what's taking place on the Tibetan Plateau really throws into sharp relief that complex relationship between the environment and security, which I understand very broadly to encompass the safety and well-being of individuals as well as states. and climate impacts on the Tibetan Plateau pose significant security risk, clearly at the local, the regional, and the national level. I think above all, the impacts of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau pose a very severe security threat to people, and the ability to adapt is going to be of critical importance both to the sustainability of the ecosystems as well as the millions of people that they serve. This one, yes. I'll just see if you've seen some maps, so I'll just run by these ones a little bit. So I'll start by making a few points about the environmental security agenda. The obvious benefit of taking a security approach is that it does elevate the issue onto the policy agenda. It bestows a sense of gravity. It gives us a sense of urgency that we have to do something. There is a need for immediate action. And undoubtedly, I think the impotence for dealing with climate change has been boosted by the claims that this is the new security challenge. In my view, the real value of the security approach lies not so much in raising alarm bells, but in drawing attention to the conflict prevention aspect of security, as well as the need for comprehensive risk assessment. A preventive security approach encourages action on the basis of a pragmatic calculation that prevention is better than cure. It's the least costly option, whether in terms of economic development, social stability, or political legitimacy. In line with this anticipatory thinking, there's now an urgent need for new policies aimed at the establishment of regionally integrated adaptation plans, cross-border early warning systems, and joint disaster relief operations. A security approach is also beneficial because it places a spotlight on the escalating competition over scarce resources in the region that threatens to undermine conservation efforts. The unfortunate reality is that even under conditions of extreme ecological vulnerability, resource shortages in China combined with high prices on the world market mean that mining operations across the Tibetan Plateau will expand rapidly in the coming years. According to the Geological and Minerals Exploitation Bureau in the Tibetan Autonomous Region, tapping minerals in Tibet, including gold, chromium, copper, lead, iron ore, and zinc, could be worth more than 1 trillion renminbi, which is about 145 billion US dollars. The acceleration of the necessary transport and communications infrastructure that is integral to natural resource exploitation now seems inevitable. Ironically, the melting of the glaciers is allowing easier access to the plateau's rich natural resources in a similar way, in a similar fashion, in which the exposure of the polar region is leading to greater competition for scarce resources and renewed geopolitical tensions. At the same time, ambitious plans are underway, as we've heard earlier, to further develop the region's hydropower potential, which may well lead to a vicious cycle of sediment accumulation that cripples the ability of dams to control floods and reduces the capacity for power generation. Climate change is already bringing about changes in flow regimes that will in turn affect the performance of hydroelectricity schemes. In the interests of mitigating climate change, hydropower is the obvious option because it provides cleaner energy. It is widely promoted in China as a pathway to a harmonious world. But the effects on downstream countries may also create the conditions for cross-border conflicts, as well as exacerbate the looming water crisis in China and the Asia region as a whole. A security approach has even greater resonance if human concerns are taken into account. Climate vulnerability on the Tibetan Plateau is increasingly seen as a threat to national security. A deeper focus on human security is vital for 3 reasons: to ensure that equity issues are taken into account, to identify risks at the subnational level, and to encourage cooperative action beyond territorial boundaries. Overall, as in the case of other regions of the world, the impacts of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau are greatest on poor communities that are least able to adapt. Those who are most harmed by climate change are those who have contributed least to its causes. They are also often those who are already marginalised and disadvantaged, with fewer resources to adapt their lives and livelihoods to the kinds of ecological damage that's already occurring, let alone what's projected to occur in the next several decades. This brings me to the question of how a climate impact's actually affecting local communities on the plateau. Tibetan nomads depend upon the grasslands for their survival, and climate change is leading to historically unprecedented pressures. For example, at the source of the Yellow River, at the centre of the plateau, over a third of the grasslands have transformed into semi-desert conditions. As environmental security analysts would predict, this is leading to increased environmental migration, largely under the auspices of a government-controlled scheme to promote the regeneration of the grasslands. Statistics are difficult to verify, but anecdotal evidence suggests that since 2000, approximately 700,000 Tibetan nomads have been resettled across the plateau. Recent studies have shown that the resettlement scheme is reinforcing existing patterns of inequality, and my own fieldwork investigations have corroborated these findings. Without an education and new skills necessary to secure alternative employment, nomads can find themselves alienated from their modern surroundings. To give you an example, these pictures were taken recently in Glacial Township, which is about 100 kilometers from Jegu in Yushu, Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture. Since 2004, up to 1,000 nomads have been transferred from their homes to a new migrant village called Kyaginomba. Out of the 229 households, the majority are currently worse off. Nomads moving out of the Yellow River source area in Himalayas County to migrant villages further north near Golmud or Guamu are living in particularly dire conditions, not least because the area lacks adequate water resources. Overall, environmental migration seems to be creating a lose-lose situation in this area of the Tibetan Plateau. A major problem is that we still do not know enough about the climate impacts on the grasslands. Field investigations are still few and far between. What we do know is that a simple causal relationship between overgrazing and environmental degradation, a kind of tragedy of the commons style scenario, is misleading precisely because it fails to take climate change into account. Hence, the approach of accelerating resettlement is unlikely to provide substantial environmental benefits, let alone sustainable livelihoods for Tibetan communities. More importantly, it greatly undervalues indigenous knowledge and the important role that the original custodians of the land can play in climate adaptation efforts. It is by no means clear that a separation of humans and nature is the solution. As noted by Mark Fogin, grasslands ecosystems have evolved over the centuries with the presence of grazers, and when mobility is removed, there is an increased risk of grasslands degradation. The lesson to be drawn here is that the path towards a more sustainable and secure future on the plateau will in part depend upon retaining those links with the past. If we lose the ice and we lose indigenous knowledge, how are we going to understand how things behaved in the past in order to establish likely scenarios for the future? The question of how to respond at the regional level is inevitably even more complex. Again, our knowledge is still limited, but what does seem clear is that the interdependencies between environmental degradation, human well-being, and regional security can only be addressed on the basis of a cooperative and people-centered approach. The critical question for policymakers is how to develop a regional response that can encourage a new strategic vision while at the same time deliver positive results in the short term. Towards this end, I'd like to offer 4 suggestions. First, given the magnitude of the emerging environmental crisis on the Tibetan Plateau, Developing an integrated regional map of the security risks involved is now an urgent task. An even-handed approach to anticipating risks entails a high level of research coordination and cross-sectoral analysis. Security analysts need to work collaboratively with environmental scientists, ethnographers, and cultural anthropologists. On this basis, current modelling work in the field of global environmental change can be supplemented with grounded analysis of potential harms at the local level. Second, building resilience to crisis requires an inventory of adaptation strategies. Appropriate adjustments can range from technological options to the establishment of early warning systems for disaster relief, institutional reforms, and behavioural changes. For centuries, local communities have had to adapt to changes in climate, and creative solutions often reside at the local level. For example, in Pakistan, pumbarash, or fire signalling, is a traditional means of flood warning. In the Mekong Delta, traditional houses are built on stilts, and in Bangladesh, they use ancient clay pots as an effective means of conserving water. In a similar vein, much can be done to build on the region's diverse experiences in disaster relief operations. There's still much to learn, and it's important to recognise that learning's an essential prerequisite for building adaptive capacity over time. Third, the region is seriously lacking relevant institutions to deal with the crisis, as Isabel mentioned earlier. A consultative process for considering adaptation options and identifying collective responses does not as yet exist. What is needed is an inclusive dialogue mechanism that can bring together many stakeholders, including vulnerable communities at risk, corporations involved in infrastructure development, and national and local governments. In general, regional security in Asia is concentrated at the state level. The involvement of corporations or non-governmental organizations is still rare. This crisis may well provide the necessary catalyst for revitalizing security cooperation by helping to dissolve the traditional boundary between the state and its people that places a serious constraint upon the capacity of states to deal with transnational security challenges. On the difficult issue of how to encourage restraint at a time of rapid industrialization in the region, we need to recognize that cultural imperatives also matter. The Ganges provides water for drinking and farming for more than 500 million people. For Hindus, it is also their holiest river. For Buddhists, water is celebrated as a cure for illness as well as misfortune. The photograph on the right-hand side was taken at the Buddhist bathing festival last September. It's a symbolic reminder that there is more to water than simply its economic value. Fourth, and at a deeper level, the threat of large-scale environmental catastrophe requires a paradigm shift in thinking. It reaffirms the need for a 21st century view of human progress that moves imperatively beyond the 19th century model of nation building based on the expansive exploitation of natural resources. Rather than simply a strategic buffer zone caught between the ambitions of two great powers, the Tibetan Plateau could become a strategic conservation zone, acting as a buffer against environmental catastrophe that threatens a fifth of humanity. Historical precedents do exist. The interdependent relationship between humans and nature that is celebrated in Buddhist culture is widely recognized. Less well known is that according to Tibetan customary practice, environmental protection was also seen as a source of conflict prevention. Rilomba, the practice of sealing mountains and lakes, dates back at least to the 12th century. In today's world, it has its modern incarnation in the form of small-scale zoning that can be expanded upon. The challenge will be to create conservation zones that transcend territorial boundaries. Clearly, implementing this kind of strategic vision would not be without its immediate economic costs. But as a guarantee of future Asian security, it may well be a price worth paying. The threat of ecosystem decline is in part a consequence of the failure to act. Hence, there is now an urgent need to look to the future and build cooperation on the basis of regional collective responsibility, not only between states but also between peoples. In conclusion, climate change is characterized by complexity, interconnectivity, and uncertainty. A clear picture of how the region is likely to be affected over the next decade is currently beyond our grasp. But one thing seems certain, the Tibetan Plateau is now on the global climate and security agenda, and it's likely to stay there for a long time to come. Coping with an uncertain future is a Herculean task and at times overwhelming. But to end on a positive note, I will leave you with this thought from Edmund Burke. Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do little. If you look closely, you can see that I have also adapted something from here, the 18th century, an 18th century understanding of power relations into a 21st century commitment to equality. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing any comments or questions.
Thank you. Okay, now remember I told you at the beginning, they were going to talk, now you get to talk. And Ron, can I have another mic here? So if you'd raise your hand Alyssa, there's a woman in the back who shot her hand up very quickly. So you get first point there. And actually, I've had really good luck with the person in the last row asking questions. So don't disappoint me. All right.
Now,
and if you could say your name and affiliation, and then succinct question. We have a half hour with them, so we'll try to be both succinct and complex and fast.
Well, now I feel a big build-up because. My name's Lisa Friedman. I'm with Climate Wire, and respecting Jennifer, what you were saying, the complexity of the story of climate science and climate change, I'm confused. I'm confused by the two messages from Isabel that the glaciers are melting by 2050 and it's inevitable, and the message that there's no evidence for that, Kenneth, and I'm hoping that, Isabel, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Kenneth's presentation. I'm also hoping that the two of you could talk about what, if any, consensus there is between the two of you on this, if it's that smart people disagree, and that's the consensus.
No, not at all.
It's two regions.
We agree.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
If you're talking about, if I'm misunderstanding, and if you're talking about two different parts,
I'm not going to talk glacier science because I really know better than to do
even
that
though you did call
of one of the maestros. However, what I would say about this difference is that this is a vast and complex region with different weather systems, different altitudes and different behaviors. So if you look at, for instance, the region that Lonnie Thompson is looking at, he talks not about, just looking at that typology, he's talking about the decapitation of glaciers, where the accumulation zone is disappearing and the glaciers are becoming separated from your accumulation. So they're actually dying from the top as well as retreating from the bottom. There is all kinds of stuff going on, and I'll leave it to the man who knows far better than I the science to explain why you should get such different behaviors in different parts of the world, in different parts of the region. I think that it would be nevertheless true to say, and certainly the science that I read and the Chinese science looking at the Chinese glaciers, is that the bulk of them are behaving, are retreating rather than advancing or accumulating. So, it's not everywhere. You get anomalies, you get different behaviors in different parts. But if you're looking at it over the whole region, and if you were just to take a very crude kind of what are most of them doing approach, as far as we know, with all the caveats about what we don't know, then retreat is the overwhelming. Is that a fair description of our... But I don't think we're fighting. We're really
No. Even though she did call glacier scientists kind of mad. Remember
no,
that?
I said people who, do ice core drilling at 20,000 feet have to be a little bit mad, but we're grateful that they're mad in that particular way.
Kenneth, I think you might have something to say here.
I suppose I was talking about two different things. On the one hand, as Isabel has just said, it's a very complex region. The area I'm looking at is a winter accumulation, high altitude, very high relief region. The Nepal-Bhutan area is a summer accumulation, relatively low elevation. The maximum precipitation is at about 2,500 meters as opposed to 5,500 meters. So on the one hand, I'm trying to say this huge area, and this is a fairly extreme kind of contrast in the glacier, but it's nothing compared to the human and security and other issues that have been raised. If we talk about the grasslands and so on, it's been I mean, so it's a window into the complexity. But it's also, secondly, I didn't say it, but I probably should say it, we have to be very careful of these agendas that emerge in the capitals and dominant research agencies and governments of the world as major kind of concerns, that we very easily get carried away by a particular message because we're so worried about this climate change thing. Okay, we're worried about it. And we see it globally. And we're looking for sort of evidence that, doesn't rubbish the message. We're looking for evidence that, but, science doesn't do that. I mean, the first paradigm of science is how do you test and refute what you're arguing for? And it just so happens, in this particular case where I'm working, the evidence goes against the dominant paradigm. And we must be prepared to say that, not least because, in fact, it creates other, in some ways, greater problems in this region of climate change. But I do have a sense that sometimes, the only image of glaciers you ever see is them collapsing into the ocean, huge kind of recession. And that's happening. But as you know, the Antarctic and Greenland ice caps may be actually growing. Did you know that? They're failing at their margins, but there's some disagreement on this, but there are a number of studies which suggest they're actually growing because the precipitation in the central of these, million square kilometer areas or whatever they are increasing in Antarctica, trebling and more. So we have to be very careful when we do this kind of stuff that we don't get so carried away with going in one direction, droughts, bigger storms, glaciers disappearing, that we miss this, ecosystem kind of complexity that is the geosphere and the hydrosphere, and emphasizing in Central Asia that it's vertical as well as horizontal and regional.
And actually, I'm going to interject and then give you. But Ken, to make sure I understood the point, was that you were saying that because they're getting, I like the image of the glaciers getting fatter, but that some of the water is just staying there, and that has, again, we don't know exactly how and in what way, that just there's still a potential large water shortage component for people downstream. So I think that, again, it's complex. But okay, you're going to jump in there real quick, and then we're going to take some more questions.
I'd just like to reinforce that importance of a critical perspective, particularly when it comes to policy solutions. Only fools rush in, and a similar issue actually with the grassland degradation, that what you see on the Tibetan Plateau is variance. What you have is a single policy solution based on an understanding of a generalized desertification across the plateau. It has consequences.
Okay, some other questions out here. I know there's some burning questions. Right here in the fourth row, Alyssa.
Hi, Dan Milstein from the Department of Energy's Energy and Environmental Security Directorate in the Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. My question is about cooperation in the region, and to what extent are the states in the region planning for climate change adaptation, and is there any coordination at all with, particularly with transboundary water?
Should I go with that? Yeah, no, thank you very much for your question, Dan. My understanding is very, very limited at the moment. And I'm looking at it, bear in mind here, not with being able to give you information from all the countries in the region, but coming from really a China perspective. And on the China side, this is very, very new. I have given a number of talks in Beijing, but the focus centrally is on mitigation. With the National Climate Assessment Report that came out in 2007, they started to look at impacts, and I think that's also a motivating force behind China's changing position on climate change at the international level. I think we are seeing some change. But actually doing something about adaptation, I don't think we're there yet. If one looks at the plans in terms of the infrastructure building, etc., one would assume that we really haven't arrived at the point where there is serious focus on adaptation. Where you have got cooperation regionally is at the science level, and I know there are a number of you in the audience who are cooperating, and I think that's a very good starting point, at least to start building on. But we are really, as I mentioned, we're really lacking that regional institutional mechanism. It might be a case of wanting to simply, as you know, in the region and in the Asia Pacific in general, that there's this huge matrix of institutions all overlapping, +3 and +4, etc. I don't think we need a +5. I think we need a single. I think this is a significant issue that has so many implications for states and people. It requires a single mechanism in and of itself. And I'm suggesting that should at first be a consultative mechanism to start the process going.
I'm still just scratching the surface, but the little bit that I'm starting to look into, I occasionally do look outside China, but that I'm seeing adaptation, I'm really seeing it the little bit that's out there in Asia is focusing on cities. So city adaptation.
Could I just? I mean, as far as I'm aware, there's very little experience sharing across borders on this, and this is, an issue just in terms of what happens to agriculture. A lot of these are agricultural communities. What happens to agricultural communities at different elevations? What substitutes for water storage? A lot of these issues could really be a common pool of information, but there isn't a mechanism at present for that to happen. And even the scientific cooperation it's relatively new, and it's still bedeviled by the security agenda. There are still places that scientists can't go. There are still places that, that data is not shared about, and come on, it's time to stop this stuff.
I actually wanted to ask Ken, because another little interesting fact that when I called him and his enthusiasm for coming down is that actually, Ken, you're going to be doing some work with Chinese glacier scientists.
Yeah,
kind of exciting. Can you tell us any, or you don't know, it hasn't started yet?
Just that I'm going on an expedition to the north side of the Karakoram, the Chinese side, with Chinese scientists. It's their expedition to look at these glaciers that are causing ice dams on the Shaxgam. But and there's no question, working with ISIMOD too, I find there's much greater impetus for that kind of cooperation than there has been for a long time. In terms of your question, Dan, of course the paradigm ought to be the Indus Waters Treaty, which, as you know, the United States was the prime mover in helping that along and negotiating it between India and Pakistan. And at the level of sort of the waterworks, the hydraulics, it's in place and it works. At the level of the things we talked about, it's not working at all. They're not sharing the science. There's no kind of cooperation, and there's not much happening. Pakistan and China have had very good relations in terms across the region I'm talking about. Karakoram Highway was built with Chinese cooperation engineers, some of the workers on the highway. So there are events, but you almost feel that I mean, you probably ought to answer this question and say, who are the guys who don't want this? Why is there so much conflict? Yeah. Why is it necessary? I mean, obviously, I think the Siachen War is a kind of, game, a game to kind of use up arms and kind of, but I don't know. And I mean, we've got throughout the region, we've got these kinds of things. Look, 20 years science went down the tube in Nepal because of the rebellion and this kind of thing. So we're looking really for leadership. I mean, why would anyone invest in a large dam without wanting this kind of cooperation, at least within the entire watershed? Or in any other, even mining, so mainly I'm puzzled, and I don't know the answer, because I think there are models that would help this along.
Some other Francis, right there in the red Ronquin. Oops.
Science. Is it on?
Yes, now it's on.
I'm Frances Lee from the National Science Foundation. Back in September, a delegation of program managers from across all the different disciplinary areas of NSF met with our counterparts in China to discuss increasing our collaboration on research related to all aspects of climate change. We had the good fortune to go on site visits and topical workshops to Xinjiang, where, among other things, we visited the Tarim Basin and also the Urumqi Glacier, where we heard that they are predicting that that particular glacier is going to completely disappear in 40 to 75 years. Now, I'd never been to Xinjiang before, and I knew it was a dry area, lots of desert, including in the Tarim Basin. So I read a little bit about it before our trip, and was surprised to find out that Xinjiang has historically, for hundreds of years, exported melons, pears, grapes, and honey melon,
Famous for it.
which you can now buy Korla pears in Silver Spring if anybody's interested, by the way. And they are now growing large acreages of cotton, which I understand is extremely thirsty, as well as needing lots of pesticides. Now, the government, the administrative power in Xinjiang is military. And that may be one reason that there seems to be this disconnect between the scientific research predictions and the basis for the economy. It seems that, all right, you've been exporting fruit for centuries, but cotton is a recent crop, and surely that's not a good thing to base your economy on these days, with the specter of the source of the Urumqi River drying up in the next half century. So, I mean, is there anything that researchers can do to make the policymakers look into the likely future? Anyway, it was very discouraging, and yes, we could point out to our Chinese counterparts the importance of factoring in the social sciences into how they address climate change.
It's not just the cotton, they're building golf courses too.
Yeah.
It would seem an odd moment to be doing that.
And I think ski resorts.
Yeah.
And make their own snow.
I mean, in the short term, there's more water if there's accelerated melt. The longer term is obviously the concern. But I'm sure there's a lot that researchers can do to look at what are more appropriate agricultural strategies in a region like that. And one concern that I have is that there's a lot of population transfer, not just in Tibetan regions, but also in Xinjiang. And these are not necessarily regions that can sustain large populations with the kind of water demands that 21st century populations, even poor ones, make. I'm not sure those cities are really going to be there in 30 years' time. So maybe they shouldn't be built. You don't have to be a military administration not to get this message, I have to say. There are other civil administrations that have been equally obtuse. But that is also the region where they were trying to accelerate the melt from bombing the glaciers in the 50s. So there is a kind of tradition of inappropriate response in that part of the world.
Yeah.
Thank you for making that point. I think it's really critical, really. It's this question, well, we know more, and we know this is what the problems are, and why isn't that translating into changes in development reforms? And for me, adaptation in this part of the region of the world really means changing the model of development. The policy mandate is there from above. There are huge problems in implementing it from below, and huge economic pressures, and in the current climate as well, seemingly it's going to become even harder to try to get this message across, combined with a lack of openness still in China. And that is highly problematic when you have very complex decisions that need to be made. If you don't have open information, it's naturally the agenda is taken over by vested interests, and I see that's being a major problem.
Okay. And Frances Rowe is going to monopolize things. The gentleman next to her, and then Anna at the end.
My name is George Pick. I am an independent scientist. I am fairly puzzled by Ms. Morton's statement that we need security risk maps. To the best of my knowledge, we have over 35 years Earth surveillance satellites and extremely high quality data on climate change. And I wonder if this 35 years of database would give you some very fundamental information about what is going to happen in the next 15, 20, 30 years.
I see, yeah, thank you for the question. Let me just clarify. When I was talking about a map of security risks, I was really talking more about impacts on food and energy security and water security specifically. And clearly, in order to achieve that kind of assessment, there is a need for collaboration with the scientists, and in terms of what's already existing with the scientists, as well as the security analysts and ethnographers, etc., together. So it was really more looking at those human, non-traditional security impacts that I was suggesting.
Yeah. And Isabel has something to add.
I just want to add briefly that satellite data is useful, but it's not enough. And that data, that it has to work hand in hand with data on the ground. And for instance, if you look at the plateau and what's happening with climate change in the plateau, there's an awful lot that satellites don't tell you. One of the odd effects of climate change on the plateau is that the surface water is disappearing in places because it sits on top of permafrost, and if the permafrost melts, the surface water drains through, and so but that's not something that you can tell from a satellite. You can't tell really what's happening to the grass. You can't tell what's happening to the biodiversity and the kind of complexity of vegetation and what that explains to you about the direction of biodiversity on the plateau. All of these things are to do with the collection of data on the ground, and I would really like to stress the point that Kathy made about indigenous knowledge in this respect, because the people who are on the ground, who have animals on the plateau, who know how many wildflowers there are this spring as opposed to last spring, which is telling you something about the behavior of the climate, those people are not really being heard right now. And they're not being heard partly because in that whole region, from Xinjiang, Tibet and so on, there is a level of suspicion between local populations and the administrations, the central governments. And you get this effect in other countries in the region for cultural and social reasons that, the knowledge of people who live in the mountains is not highly valued by the people who live in the cities. All of these things play in. But we need all these sources of information, really, to construct a sense of of what's happening, and we need work across scientific disciplines. This is not just about what's happening with glaciers. This is, all scientific disciplines need to be brought to bear on this problem, which is another challenge.
Okay.
Can I just
Yeah, sure.
add? There is another and a different. We have these 35 years of imagery, but the people who work on imagery, GIS, those kinds of things, are in the same rat race you're in with your iPod or your cell phone or your computer or your TV. The way data was processed, the kind of data you needed, at least in the major research centers 10 years ago, is not what you're looking for now. There's this tremendous rush forward into new and more sophisticated and more detailed kind of analyses. And so, in a strange way, we don't benefit from that length of time of imagery which you're speaking of. And I mean, I kind of walked through with it, when it first came out in the early 70s. Wow, it was amazing. But now you look at that stuff and you say, what can I do with this? Because I can't get the kind of information I want. So, in a way, the tail is wagging the dog of the technology rather than the technology offering the kinds of solutions that we feel perhaps, were already very readily available quite some time ago.
Okay, Ron, going to give it to Anna, and then the gentleman in the back in the middle. Okay, Isabel, go. Anna, sorry.
From the Congressional Executive Commission on China. And I'm interested in hearing if there are specific actors or organizations inside China that are raising these human security issues related to climate change, and if they are, questioning some of the mainstream policies to deal with adapting or mitigating grassland deterioration. And do they actually have channels for communicating their ideas and their research to policymakers?
Yeah, I think that was a question made just for you, Catherine.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks for that question. Yes. And I'll give you an example. Actually, one of the first reports to look at the impacts of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau that came out about 4 years ago was by Greenpeace. And Greenpeace worked in collaboration with the Chinese Academy of Scientists. And one of the most interesting developments, I think, in civil society in general at the moment is that you have grassroots NGOs, not just international, but also Chinese grassroots NGOs in the area where I'm working in Yushu, collaborating with scientists. I think that's a very positive development, precisely for the reasons that we've just been reiterating about the importance of bringing the modelling together with the field research on the ground, working with that community level. So that has been happening, I think, over the sort of the past 4 years or so. And there's been a couple of international conferences held by WWF that brought together grassroots organisations with scientists to discuss some of these issues. And I think that's available on the web if you're interested.
And just it's still somewhat nascent. There's that Beijing-based it's a youth climate group,
yes,
and they emailed me and they specifically said, Dr. Turner, you are very famous in your field, and I love that. And they said, we want to meet scientists who could help us design activities, because a lot of the student environmental associations in China are from the environmental science field, and I got a couple of social science tossed in there probably for flavor. But I thought but it was really intriguing to me, because in actuality, and I'm sure Anna does know this, that very few Chinese NGOs they don't really talk about climate, very locally based. But again, it's in the last couple of years I'm getting more inquiries from the Chinese NGOs. So that's kind of it's a little trend. Okay, the gentleman right in the back there, waiting oh so patiently.
Thank you. I'm Bob Davis from the Mountain Institute. And just a quick follow-up question to Isabel's point. Are we seeing consistency between what local communities and indigenous knowledge indicates is happening on the ground and what we're hearing from the scientific community, or is that picture just as complex as the rest of the picture that Ken gives us? Or are we hearing reports of community consultations that are very consistent with some of the scientific data on what's happening? So that's for all of you.
Yeah, I was going to say that could be a closing out question. I planted that question, actually. No, okay, go ahead.
I suppose yes and no. It's the previous question and yours triggers in my mind that there are a lot of young people in the mountain villages in the Himalaya and a lot of young scientists from China who are using new technologies and in many cases being supported by their communities to use new technologies to look into all of these things and to inquire in them. And in many cases, it's those people who are kind of ahead of the game. I mean, I came through this, the Chinese glaciologists of my age spent most of their years that could have been productive in farm work during the Cultural Revolution. I mean, most famous, Shi Yafeng, brilliant work in glaciers, but 15 years of his main period of when he could have been active, he had to do that. Suddenly, it's all changing in the last 5 to 10 years, and we're having young scientists coming along, a commitment to good science. It's very technocratic, and that's why I think you're feeling that we're not getting the social science in there. It's still kind of, it must be kind of really solid science, and so the guys who have really good English and really good science skills are the ones who are published and who are coming out. But they're picking up on these things extremely well. I don't know how that's articulating in many of the institutions, but that's a really... and so we're talking. I mean, my students who are now professors are talking on the email with boys in college from the villages in the High Karakoram about conservation strategies, about what's happening to the... And they're way ahead of most of us in the... Yeah.
Okay, Catherine, this is our closeout question.
Yeah, sorry to balance the positive response to Anna's question. I think still the idea of indigenous knowledge from a China perspective, there's a long way to go. As I was trying to talk about in my presentation, the whole idea that sitting there and spending time talking to Tibetan nomads can actually be of the national interest. We haven't really arrived at that point yet, but hopefully there will be some momentum building here. Secondly, it's tough work. It is tough work. You are at 4,500 meters, usually -10, -20 degrees. It's incredibly time-consuming. It's not like being in a laboratory. You're sitting there and you're waiting for the head of the household to return from herding, and sort of the time goes and goes and goes, and 10 hours later you're still sitting there and you're still drinking your tea and you're still sitting there, and then I have to go back to my university and they say, "Where's your publication?" So
it's in the field.
It is. It takes an enormous commitment, is what I'm trying to say, to do this kind of work. And there are people increasingly that are doing that, particularly ethnographers and anthropologists that are doing this kind of work and linking in with the scientists.
Just one very briefly on whether it's a mixed picture. Yes, it is. And it's a mixed picture on the plateau complicated by a kind of political... a policy decision which is based more on politics than science. That being that it's taken as read that there is degradation across the plateau, that it's caused by overgrazing, hence the settlements that Kathy was talking about. There are a number of quite interesting studies going on about grazing and resilience, and whether grazing actually boosts the resilience of grasslands. And again, grassland is a kind of big issue, a big subject, and full of diversity itself. But one of the studies that was done by a US-based scientist suggested that grazing actually was of considerable benefit in terms of climate resilience. So taking the people and the animals off the grassland isn't necessarily the right thing to do. So I'm certainly very encouraged by the investment in science that's happened, partly, I think, provoked by concern about climate change and climate change impacts. The fact that the Yellow River is dying has been a big impetus to serious meteorology on the plateau. The fact that the North China Plain is running out of water very fast. All these things have made the government throw quite a lot of money into the science. And I just hope that we don't fall back, as has happened in China historically, on big engineering solutions that are not necessarily solutions. Preponderance of engineers in the Chinese leadership is not necessarily make it more open to other ways of looking at a problem, rather than building more dams, canals, and routing water from one stressed part of the country to another. I think this is an evolving situation, and I guess we're all interested in it evolving in as open and constructive a way as possible.
Okay. Before we do applause for them, I have two little things to say. One is that, today, first of all, do you guys feel like you've learned something? Your brains are a little heavier and bigger. But what's also, it's exciting, but it's also a little discouraging, because we've really only scratched the surface, both on the challenges and also that shopping list she gave, right? She's got the third poll project that we're going to, over dinner, going to plot and plan about how the China Environment Forum, the Wilson Center, that maybe we could get involved to try to help with the networking, because we've got the China side pretty well. And we're trying a little bit. We do have it's very, very simple. But Alyssa, one of our interns back there, just completed a research brief, just trying to gather existing information on just more broadly climate impacts on China. And you would think that would be pretty easy. And she's like saying no, but it's often very insightful. The difficulty that we had doing that just makes me want to do it more. All right, would you applaud these really smart people here?